Okay, so in this video we're going to be taking a look at both the slider control and the text area control. So I want to go ahead and do both of these together, since at the end of this I'm going to go ahead and put together a small program that's going to be using both of these controls. So we'll start off getting into the slider control. So this is going to be used to display a control in the application window that allows you to graphically adjust a number within a range of values. So likely seen a slider before. It's just kind of a bar with a knob that you can move back and forth to adjust some value. Most commonly you probably see this when you're trying to adjust the volume on a computer or maybe on your phone. You'd see a slider control that comes with that. So the constructor for a slider is going to require 3 values. So there's going to be 3 numbers that you put in. The first 2 values are used to specify the min and max. So using volume as an example, you'd have something like 0 and 100. And then the third value is going to be whatever you want the default value to be. So maybe if you want to put that right in the middle, in this case we're doing 0 to 50, so right in the middle would be 25. For that volume example, that'd be 0 to 100, so right in the middle would be 50. So a slider is going to generate a change event whenever the slider's value changes. So anytime that you move that knob up and down on the that bar for the slider, that's going to cause this change event to be fired. So an event listener will need to be added. In this case, we're going to be working with the value property method to access the properties of the value that you're trying to modify to. And we're going to use this add listener method. So a more roundabout way of accomplishing the same behavior as the set on action method that we see with things like buttons, radio buttons, controls, combo boxes. So in this case, there's going to be 3 things that we need to put into our event listener for a slider. So the first one's going to be observable. We're not going to worry too much about that particular one. That's primarily just for an observable list. The second 2 values, the old value and new value, these are going to be the ones that we're actually interested in. So old value is going to keep track of whatever the previous value was for that slider. So you're going to take it from one value to another value. So whatever value you're changing it from is the old value, and whatever value you're changing it to is going to be the new value. So in most cases, whenever you're working with a slider, probably what you actually care about is going to be that new value. So you want to get whatever the current value happens to be after you've moved that knob to some new spot. So the current value of a slider, after a change occurs, can be fetched from that new value parameter. And in addition to that, I'm also going to show another way that we can get the value from a slider in a moment. But the first thing we're going to go ahead and focus on now is going to be the different ways that we can actually customize the appearance of our slider. So there are going to be several methods, including many for displaying different levels of information. So the first one we have is the set orientation method, which is going to take an orientation of some kind. So this method sets the slider to either a horizontal or vertical arrangement. We have the set show tick marks method. This is going to take a boolean, either true or false. This is going to be used to indicate if tick marks should be visible or not. The set major tick unit value method is going to set the spacing, the mark spacing for your major ticks. The set minor tick count value. This method is going to set the number of minor tick marks between the major tick marks. So trying to keep track of all of that. Essentially what we're working with is you might have major tick marks, so very large, very noticeable tick marks at particular intervals that you would consider to be the most important. So probably using the volume example again, you have it from 0 to 100. Your major tick marks could be at every 10th value. So you have 0, 10, 20, 30, all the way up to 100. And then you would also include some minor ticks, so minor tick marks in between them. So these would typically be smaller, shorter tick marks. Probably also, unlike the major tick marks, you wouldn't actually show the number, so like the count on those minor tick marks. Additionally, while we can go ahead and do this in the constructor, you can also use the set max and set min methods to set the sliders maximum and minimum values respectively. I'm not going to worry too much about using these methods since I primarily will just rely on the constructor to do this for me, and we're not really going to be taking a look at an example where we intend to change the properties of the slider itself. We also have a couple of other methods. So we've got things like set snap to ticks. This will take a boolean, either true or false. This will indicate whether or not the slider knob should snap to the closest tick mark. There's going to be the set show tick labels. So this will either be true or false. This indicates whether or not the major tick marks should have their visible numeric labels. So this is the one that's used to indicate if we should actually show that 10, 20, 30 for each of those major tick marks. Then there's the set block increment. This determines how much to move the slider knob whenever the user clicks the slider's track or uses the keyboard to move the knob. So maybe if you use the arrow keys, this is in a horizontal arrangement, you'd use the left and right arrow keys, or in a vertical arrangement, the up and down arrow keys. This determines how much to move the knob if you're operating it in that way. So the default configuration for a slider is going to be initially a horizontal orientation, no visible tick marks. It will use 25 units of spacing. It's going to have 3 minor tick marks between the major tick marks. Uses a maximum value of 100 and a minimum value of 0. It does not have any snapping of the slider knob. The labels are not displayed for the major tick marks, and you will move 10 units whenever the slider knob is moved using like the arrow keys or just clicking against the bar or the track of the slider. So another way that we could show that default configuration, if you want to see the lines of code necessary to achieve that. So we've got our slider.setOrientation. We're doing orientation.horizontal. Slider.show tick marks. That's going to be set to false. Set major tick unit is going to be 25. Set minor tick count is going to be 3. Set max and set min are 100 and 0. Set snap to ticks will be false. Set show tick labels also going to be false. And then set block increment is going to be 10. So this is the lines of code in order to achieve this behavior for your slider. And then the last thing I want to go ahead and mention is going to be with the set value and get value methods. These are going to be used to set the slider's current value or to get the slider's current value respectively. So the set value method, just like when we're working with a combo box, is pretty useful for being able to select a particular default value when you first open up the application, or just in a general sense, being able to programmatically set the value. And then with the get value method, what we can use here is either going to be an integer or a double, kind of depends on the units that you're using for your slider. The example that I'll be doing, it would primarily be dealing with int. So we can go ahead and use that to get whatever value the slider currently holds. This is basically the equivalent of using that new value parameter if you're doing this from inside of the event handler for a slider. Okay, so we'll go ahead and hold off on getting to TextAreas for a moment. We'll go ahead and take a look at just the slider controls. So I'm going to go ahead and come over here. I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to make a new JavaFX application for this. Click next. So for the project name for this one, so I'm going to be using both the slider and the TextArea controls. And the way that I'm going to be doing this particular program, or this particular demo, we're going to go ahead and use this to set the font of text, specifically the font size of text in the text area, based on whatever value our slider currently holds. Let's go ahead and finish this. So we'll go ahead and do a little bit of cleanup. Go ahead and keep our action event and event handler. We'll go ahead and remove these 2 imports. Go ahead and remove our extra comments that we're not going to need. Make some slight adjustments to the style. Okay. And so right here in the start method, what we're going to want to do is add in our slider. We'll then also include a label so we can distinguish what that slider is being used for. We'll also go ahead and set up all that customization for our slider since we have particular values, say like the min, max, and the tick marks that we want to specify for it. And then we'll also go ahead and make sure that we've got our containers at least a little bit set up so that we can kind of display the label and the slider. Do about half of the program for right now. Then we'll talk a little bit about text areas and add in the remaining half. So to start off with, we need to make sure that we're bringing in our slider, our label, and we're also going to use an HBox. So we're going to have the slider and the label just side by side. So we need to bring in all three of those things. We're going to do import javafx.scene.layout.hbox. So this will be our container. So import javafx.scene.control.label. So we're going to be using this to indicate what the slider is for. And import javafx.scene.control.slider. Okay. So right here, we'll go ahead and create our label. I'm going to call this my font size label. It's equal to a new label. And right here, we're going to say font size, a colon and a space. So this will be the label that's associated with our slider. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is create the slider itself. So we're going to have our slider, call this font size slider. It's equal to a new slider. And right here, I want to go ahead and put in some different values for it. So since I'm going to be doing this for font size, I'm going to use a min and a max for just a very particular range of font sizes. So we're going to do anything from 10 to 36. And then I'll also go and give it a default value so that it's initially set to 12. So kind of like the default value that you typically see for most text editor or maybe like Microsoft Word applications. And then we'll go ahead and start using each of those different methods to customize this. So we're going to have our font size slider dot set show tick marks. So we want this to be set to true. So we will go ahead and show those tick marks. We'll go ahead and do our major tick unit. So font size slider dot set major tick unit. And for this one, since we're dealing with font sizes, as you probably know, particularly when you're dealing with 10 through 36, usually the font sizes go every, and the drop-down menu, they go every other size. So you see like 10, 12, 14, 16. So I'm going to go ahead and do a major tick unit of 2. So it'll be every other unit for the font size will be a major unit. So then, of course, the minor tick count, there's really only one value that we can use for it. So do font size slider dot set minor tick count. That'll be 1. That way then every other one, so all of the odd counts are going to be our minor tick counts, and we'll just see a smaller tick mark for those. Then I'll also go ahead and do the labels. I'm going to do font size slider dot set show tick labels. So that one's initially going to be set to true, so I do want to go ahead and show those. And then also set snap to ticks. We'll go ahead and make this one true as well, since we don't really have any intention of letting the user choose decimal values for the font size. Certainly possible, but ideally we're going to go ahead and exclude that behavior. And then one additional method that I want to go ahead and include here. So this one's a bit more general. It's not something that's particular to just sliders, but I'm going to go ahead and make use out of the set pref width method so that I can go ahead and make the actual size of the slider a little bit longer. That way then the spacing, the actual physical spacing between all of the different markers is enough that we can actually see everything. Otherwise, if it's too small or too narrow, everything's going to be kind of bunched together, and it's going to be really hard to see any of the values. So we're going to do set pref width, and for this one I'm going to go ahead and set the width to 300. So then the next thing I want to go ahead and do is create my hbox. So we'll go ahead and make that. We'll call this one just hbox in all lowercase. So equal to a new hbox. I don't really need very much spacing between them since I've got a space right here anyway. So we'll just do something like 5 for this. And have our font size label, and then our font size slider. And then right here we'll go ahead and create our scene. So equal to a new scene. And this is going to be taking our hbox. And primarily because of the types of controls I'm going to be using here, since I'm going to be using a slider and a text area, as we'll see in a moment, the default dimensions or the preferred dimensions for the scene will actually look pretty reasonable to start off with. So I don't really need to worry too much about specifying my own height and width for it here. So I'm just going to leave those two arguments out. So then the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is just set up our stage. So we're going to set the scene using that scene object that we have. We'll go ahead and do primary stage at set title. So for this one, we'll go ahead and call this our set font demo. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and show it. And save that. And so now we'll go ahead and run this. Take a quick look at how our application is appearing with just the slider control added to this. Okay, so you see we've got our font size right here. We've got our slider, so we can see the 10 for the minimum value, the 36 for the maximum value. We see the 12 as the default value that it initially chooses. We can also see the minor tick marks in between our major tick marks, and you can also see how I mentioned before that the major tick marks have these slightly longer, more noticeable tick marks to them, but then the minor ones are a little bit shorter and a little bit smaller. And also, the set pref width that I used is making sure that this is up to 300. If I were to exclude that, it would just try to use a default value that's going to kind of push the numbers together as close as possible, and it becomes very hard to read one value from the other. Okay, and then of course if we move this, if I start to move it a little bit, so you can see I can kind of drag it anywhere I want, but as soon as I let go of it, it's going to snap to a particular mark somewhere on there. So that's because of the fact that we're using that set snap to tick marks. We're setting that to true. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close this. Come back over here for a moment. So we can go ahead and talk about the text area control. So the text area is going to be effectively just a multi-line text field. So it accepts some input, or we can use it to display some output. So it's kind of useful as being sort of like a almost like a text editor if you want to be able to use it for some kind of application like that. So we'll construct our text area. It's going to be equal to a new text area. We're showing a string here with some placeholder text that will be displayed inside of that text area whenever you first open up the application. You can also use the getText method to be able to get whatever text is currently in your text area. Anytime that you get the text from it, it's going to be stored as a string. So we see here string input. Essentially, it's going to be just like when you're working with a text field. The general behavior here is exactly the same. The size of the text area can be indicated with the setPref row count or the setPref column count methods. Each one of these can be used to determine the number of rows and columns respectively. So basically, it's a way to try to control the height or the width of the text area. So they just have a particular way that they approach that. There's also going to be the setWrapText method. By setting this to true, this will indicate that you want to wrap text to the next line in your text area, meaning that whenever you are typing some text into your text area, it's going to go from left to right. So when it reaches the rightmost edge, if this method is set to true, then it's going to move to the next line anytime that it hits that rightmost edge. Otherwise, if this is set to false or you just don't specify it, so by default it's set to false, then instead what it's going to do is just keep going to the right And at that point, then you probably have to use a scroll bar of some kind to be able to move back and forth. So in most cases, typically what you want to do is make sure that set wrap text is true. So to be able to fetch text from the text area or to insert text into the text area, so you can make use out of that get text method to get some text from it, or you can use the set text method to put some text or put some content into that text area. So very similar to the text field. So we'll go ahead and close this, come back over to NetBeans, we'll go ahead and finish up this project. So coming back up to the top real quick, I need to go ahead and add in another control for this. So we're going to use that text area control. So we'll do an import javafx.scene.control.textArea. And then right here, we're going to go ahead and do another import, since I'm going to go ahead and bring in another container. So in addition to this hbox that I'm using for my label and slider, so that little pair that we have there, I'm also going to include a vbox so that I can put this text area underneath that hbox. I'm going to do javafx.scene.layout.vbox and save that. So then coming down here, so we've got all of our setup right here, and we've done our hbox. So let's say that after setting up this hbox, we'll go ahead and create our text area. So we're going to make a text area. The name for this, I'll just go ahead and call it text area in all lowercase. This is going to be equal to a new text area. Let's say that by default I don't have any content initially, so it'll just be a blank text area when we first open up the application. I'm also going to make sure that I have that set wrap text method as true, because I do want the text to wrap to the next line. So we'll go ahead and say our text area dot set wrap text to true. And then once I've done this, I want to go ahead and create the functionality or the behavior for my slider. So the way that this is going to work is that whenever we change the value of the slider, we want to get whatever the current value is and use that value to specify what the font size should be for our text area. So this is going to be another case where I'm working with a very small amount of CSS. Again, we're just going to be using a single line to modify the font size for our text. So because of that, this is going to be yet another case where I can just go ahead and use inline styling. It should be fairly easy to work with, since the amount of CSS code that I need is very small, and I don't really have any intentions of making it any larger than this. So we're going to go ahead and get our font size slider. We then want to go ahead and use the value property method to go ahead and give us this one right here, to go ahead and get that property for our value. We're going to add a listener. And for this event listener that we're going to be using here, again, there's going to be 3 values that we need. So we need observable, we then need old value, and we need new value. We'll then do this as a lambda expression, so I'm going to use that arrow and then my pair of curly braces for the body of this lambda expression. And so right here, what I can go ahead and do, there are 2 ways that I could approach getting whatever the current value of that font size slider happens to be. So I'll go ahead and show both of those, just so you can see either one of them. So first, we've got our text area.setStyle. So we want to go ahead and set the style of our text area to something. So in this case, we're going to be modifying the font size. So we're going to use the fx font size property. And again, just like we did with the combo box, I'm going to be doing some string concatenation to concatenate the property with a particular value that we're getting from the program itself. So the first way I'll go ahead and do this, I'll do this I would say the more verbose way first. So we're going to do our font size slider.getValue. So this is just going to give us whatever the current value of the font size slider happens to be, and we're going to use that with our fx font size to modify the size of the text in our text area. And then once we've done all that, then we see we've got our HBox right here. So I want to go ahead and make a VBox that's going to be taking this HBox and this text area. So we're going to go ahead and display those with the HBox on top and the text area underneath it. So we're going to do VBox is equal to, or VBox, we'll call this VBox in all lowercase. This is equal to a new VBox. And right here, we're going to go ahead and do something like 10 pixels or 10 points of spacing. We'll have the HBox on the top. So that's going to have the font size label and the font size slider. That'll be at the top of our application. And then underneath it, we're going to have our text area. And then the last thing I need to go ahead and do, since we're using the VBox to hold all of the content for our application, that's going to need to be my new root node. So I'm going to go ahead and change this right here to say new scene with the VBox as my root node. We'll go ahead and save that, and then we'll run this and see how everything looks and behaves. Okay, so we've got our font size slider right here at the top. So we still have our label, our slider. We now have our text area right here. So we have this entire space to work with. So enter some text into this text area control. And so then whenever I add this, so by default, when we first start running it, it'll start off with this, this font size we have right here. So if I go ahead and start modifying this, we can see that as I continue to move the slider either up or down, it will continuously increase the size of the text. And you can also see that once the text gets so large that it hits that rightmost edge, it's going to go ahead and wrap to the next line because I did set wrap text to true. And then of course if I wanted to, I can go ahead and move it all the way back down again, all the way to something like 10. So you can see the resizing of the text. So ideally we want it somewhere around here. I think by default they use something more like 14 or 16. Seems like they might use 16 by default. Okay. So at this point, this is going to wrap up everything with the slider and the text area, seeing this little demo demonstrating the use of both. In the next video, we're going to start wrapping up on Chapter 13 by taking a look at the last two advanced controls that I want to go through, which are going to be menus. So in general, it's going to be with menu systems and with the file chooser class or the file chooser control.